Welcome to a webcast of a panel discussion from the 42nd Annual Conference, presented by the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions, Hunter College. The discussion took place in April 2015 at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City.
We have a reporters roundtable for you this afternoon. And basically what we do in our work on a daily basis, whether we're management or faculty, we often long for coverage from the media on the important work we do. And when we don't get it, we sometimes lament and wonder, what is it we have to do to get our stories covered? What do journalists look for? What are some of the issues that they're investigating at this time? And so we have a panelist of journalists who will be talking to us each, roundtable, informal discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. To my left is Colleen Flaherty, who's a reporter who covers faculty issues for Inside Higher Ed. Her work has appeared in Slate, Times Higher Education, The Australian, the Associated Press, and more. She was a military editor prior to doing the work with Inside Higher Ed at the Killeen Daily Herald, right outside of Fort Hood, Texas. She's also reported for the Greenwich Times and comes to us from McGill University in Montreal with a degree in English. To her left, we have Peter Schmidt, who is we have Stephen Greenhouse, who is retired from the New York Times, retired in December 2014 after 31 years as a reporter there. In his last 19 years at the time, he was the labor and workplace reporter. Before that, he worked with the Times Midwest Business and corresponded from Chicago. His work, one of his seminal works was The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker in 2008. And finally, Peter Schmidt, a senior writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where he covers work in academic labor, affirmative action, educational research, and issues related to academic freedom. His work, The Color and Money, How Rich White Kids Are Winning the War Over College Affirmative Action. He has reported for Education Week, earned several awards, including the National Education Writers Association, Virginia Press, and the Unity Award for coverage in minority issues. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Anyone of you can begin.
Sure. Okay, so I'll keep my comments brief because I'm mostly interested in hearing what you all have to say and maybe getting some stories, ideas out of this session. But Teresa asked us to talk a little bit about what we see as, being the major labor relations issues in higher ed right now, and then give a little bit of practical advice about connecting with us on some of these issues. So from my point of view, and it seems like a lot of other panelists here today, this is a really exciting, dynamic time to be covering labor in higher education. And again, you all really are the experts, but I see two somewhat divergent but related trends. So first, I see a lot of challenges to unions among public college faculty in states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, and most recently Ohio, where just last week, faculty members there discovered that the House Finance Committee had inserted yeshiva-type language into a 3,090-page budget bill pending before the State House. So obviously this was really concerning to them because very similar language actually was signed into law there 4 years ago. Before it was defeated by voters in a referendum. But again, faculty members are taking this quite seriously, and they are concerned that it's going to pass, both because last time the bill was sort of sweeping and involved a lot of other kinds of unions. This time it seems to be a little bit more targeted at faculty, and again, it's tucked into this massive budget bill, so it's definitely something we're watching. But in contrast, though, I see something of the opposite happening at private institutions. As you all know, the NLRB's ruling in the Pacific Lutheran case, which included a detailed analytical framework for determining who's a managerial employee and who is not, has been interpreted by a lot of colleges and universities as a major threat to yeshiva. even though the faculty union in that case was part-time. We definitely have been talking to administrators who are really watching this case and are very concerned about what forthcoming decisions are going to mean for faculty unions generally at private institutions. So also at private institutions, the NLRB, or also in the Pacific Lutheran case, the NLRB challenged longstanding precedents against faculty unions at religiously affiliated institutions stemming from NLRB v. Catholic Bishops of Chicago in 1979. And as you all probably know, the board determined through a lot of public or testimony and public input that the adjunct faculty members who wanted to form a union at Pacific Lutheran didn't have the specific kinds of religious duties that would put them outside of NLRB jurisdiction. So this has major implications potentially for the many other mostly Catholic institutions where adjuncts are trying to form unions. Recently, all of those cases were basically sent back to their local regional NLRB offices for reevaluation under the new framework, and we're definitely waiting to see what happens with those cases going forward. Also at private institutions, we've seen a wave of graduate student organizing following NYU's largely unexpected decision to recognize the UAW-affiliated graduate student worker union there. Initially, I think some graduate students on other campuses who were disappointed with that development because they hoped to be able to point to the NYU NLRB case if it was positive towards the graduate students union there to bolster their own cases. So I guess initially talking to graduate students at other campuses, they were quite disappointed with that development. But recently, since March, when the NYU students ratified a contract that included 4% raises, $100,000 tax-free childcare funds, healthcare, I've seen a lot of renewed, if not optimism, then determination from graduate students on other campuses about what can be accomplished outside of NLRB channels, potentially, and also maybe even through the NLRB. And so last, it's been mentioned a lot already here this morning, the growth of adjunct unions in the last few years has been undeniable, much of it a result of SEIU's Adjunct Action campaign across metro areas. And I think that there are some really interesting questions to address about those contracts now that there's something of a critical mass to study, and many of which I guess will be answered or already have been at this conference today. So I guess the more practical advice about connecting with us on these issues, I am interested pretty much in everything and anything related to these cases, others that I haven't heard of. So I guess my advice is a little bit more practical, like I said. Email is probably the best way to reach us. My editors travel quite often, so sometimes if I can just forward almost a quick sort of rundown of what's going on, who it involves, I can shoot it off to them and get approval to sort of jump on it when I'm back in the office. And then just turnaround time. When I'm trying to reach you for a story, I know faculty members, often work, you have a lot going on during the day, and then your deadlines are longer term. Our turnaround is usually a lot shorter, so I try to specify my deadlines in an email or a message, but it's actually really helpful sometimes when I'm working on a story if someone says, I don't have time to get back to you right now, but I will at a certain time, rather than me sort of waiting until the end of the day to, be able to figure out if the story is going to happen or not. Other than that, I am really looking forward to hearing your story ideas, meeting you here at the microphone or outside, and via email and phone going forward. Thanks.
Stephen.
So I remember 15 years ago or so, I was talking to an adjunct professor, and she told me she was making, I think, $1,200 for a course. And I did some quick math in my head, say a 12-week semester, 20 hours a week, preparation, teaching, grading papers, 12 times 20 is 240, divide that into 1,200 hours, that's $5 an hour. I said, that's pretty screwed up. And so I've really kept my eye on the adjunct professor issue over the years, as have other reporters at the New York Times. Joe Berger's written about them, Tamar Lewin has written about them, Rachel Swarns, Corey Gilgannon. And adjuncts do a very good job keeping themselves in your face, so to speak. If I wrote a story about, car wash workers being paid too little or janitors being paid too little, I'd inevitably get 2 or 3 emails from adjuncts saying, "What about us? We're terribly screwed as well. You should write more about us." And as I said in an earlier panel where I was moderating, when I wrote this book a few years ago, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker, the biggest mistake I made was I didn't write about adjunct professors. And I had spent a good amount of research, preparing a profile of an adjunct professor north of Los Angeles who worked at 3 public community colleges, and he was on the go from 8 a.m. till 9 p.m., 10 p.m. each day, running like a bumblebee between campuses, and he could barely make ends meet. And when push came to shove, my editor and I decided what to keep in the book. We decided I should only focus on private sector workers, and he ended up, unfortunately, on the cutting room floor. I'm sure my book sales would have tripled if I had kept an adjunct professor in the book. Now, it's one of the really... So what's going on now with organizing adjunct professors is really fascinating, and I'm occasionally invited to give speeches, and I say, the most successful area right now in union organizing in the country by far is organizing adjuncts, and it really is like a prairie fire. And I wonder why it's going on now, partly because the SEIU, the steelworkers, other unions are really pushing very hard to do it. But I think a lot of adjuncts are feeling mightily aggrieved. They're very smart, articulate people. A lot of them are pretty fearless, and they become less fearful as they see folks at other schools unionize. And that's, I think maybe one of the big stories right now in education is the organization of adjuncts. And somewhat coupled with that, we're seeing this explosion of efforts by graduate students at Columbia, Tufts, Cornell, Brown, Harvard, Yale, New School. They're all trying to unionize. They're all trying to persuade their schools to do what NYU did and grant voluntary recognition. Meanwhile, my sense is that the NLRB is fast-tracking a case that might overturn the Bush. The Obama board is going to reverse that probably in the next few months. So we'll have even more ferment on universities in terms of organizing. My sense is the SEIU's strategy is very successful, in organizing 6, 7, 8 campuses in the Boston area, 3, 4, 5. Stop me if I'm wrong. In the D.C. area, American, Georgetown, George Washington, probably some others I don't even know about. Is they've thrown massive resources into it. I think adjuncts, when they see all this ferment and they say, well, people unionize at this school, we got to do it at our school, and at Tufts they won this, and we want to win the great stuff that they won at Tufts. And I think the strategy has really been very successful in creating this huge and rapid unionization of adjuncts. A minute or two on coverage. So when I was, I was labor reporter for the New York Times for 19 years, and it kind of drove me crazy, and I'm sure it drives Pete and everyone crazy that we get 50 emails a day from different people saying write about us, write about us, law firms, unions, management, lawyers, and so I tell people it's important to have a good story. It's important to frame it well. Several reporters at the Times over the years have written very eloquent stories about highly screwed adjunct professors. Tamar Lewin wrote a piece last year about a couple in the Boston area where one of the professors said, adjuncts, we use the trunk of our car as our office, rushing back between classes to dump one set of books and materials and get what we needed for the next class. Then one day, our office got towed. I decided right then to get involved with the union. Then Corey Kilgannon, a fellow native Massapequan like me, and Alec Baldwin and Jerry Seinfeld, had a very good piece in the Times quoting an adjunct at National Community College and Mercy College, saying, few adjuncts complain publicly, Ms. Sarasoli said, because they're afraid they might not get hired again. I think that's changing partly because of this, people are becoming less fearful as a result of this unionization drive. She said, living out of a suit, she was homeless when Corey wrote this piece. Living out of a suitcase makes it hard to keep her paperwork organized and has led to awkward episodes. Once after teaching an evening class in the Bronx, she slept in her car in a teacher's parking garage so she could head out to an early class at Nassau, but a guard took her to task. Quote, he tried to kick me out like a criminal, and I'm screaming, I'm faculty, she recalled. I guess they don't expect to find a homeless professor sleeping in her car in the parking garage. So I mention those stories because, reporters like good, riveting, harrowing stories. They want kind of more than the average, struggling adjunct professor. They often want someone who is in a more dire position. Now, there's a lot of interest in the unionization efforts by adjuncts, and I think a lot of editors and reporters are keeping an eye on it. Then the problem becomes, well, if you write about the success at Tufts and Lesley and George Washington and Georgetown, you write about every next union success. So in ways the bar gets higher in terms of trying to get reporters to write the next story about adjunct unionization. I could rumble on, but I'll stop there.
Thanks. I share my fellow reporters' interest in issues such as unionization of adjuncts and National Labor Relations Board rulings and how that is changing. I think as a practical matter, given that the panel's kind of focused on how reporters work and what we're thinking about, I'd kind of talk to you a little bit about that process and how we weed through the 50 emails that we get every day, or how at least at the Chronicle we're doing that and deciding what to cover and what not. The first thing to keep in mind is that we're looking for stories that resonate with a large number of readers. And usually stories resonate for reasons that are almost instinctive sometimes. People want to see something coming. Since the days of cavemen, you wanted to see what was approaching on the horizon. So we'll be looking for a story that we're seeing a new development or an innovation or something like that. So if there's a provision in a contract that people haven't thought of before that's interesting, or a tweak in state law dealing with labor conditions that totally changes the game, we'll be focused on that. It was a small thing, but for example, in Washington State, they were considering a state law that would let adjuncts become school teachers, and that was kind of an interesting thing to look at. The other thing we're looking for is things that resonate with people in terms of their own jobs and issues that they're dealing with. I can give you an example of a story that was very successful for us. In this day and age, being online as well as in print, we measure how much interest there is in what we publish. A story that got a lot of attention was one that was actually, I was tipped off by the AAUP chapter at Eastern Michigan University, but the Yik Yak controversy up there. And that was a situation, just to briefly recap the story, 3 teachers were teaching a class. A lot of the students, it was a mandatory class, a lot of the students didn't want to be there, and they were using an anonymous online app called Yik Yak to heckle the teachers, often using language that the faculty members thought crossed the line, the professors. And it became a union issue because the AUP chapter has said, we want to put this on the table as a bargaining issue, some sort of protection from this sort of incivility with our students, and especially if it's crossing the line and being sexist and racist and what have you. So that story resonated in a lot of ways. It was, faculty members who've had disciplinary problems in their classrooms liked that story. Faculty, and often commented on it. Faculty members who have looked out at, half a room full of people on their laptops on Facebook or taking cell phone calls or whatever, the whole technology thing appeal to them. The whole dynamic of having a class that students really don't want to be in, and whether, so the story took off in a lot of different directions because it was a broadly appealing story that touched on a lot of issues. Whereas at the converse of that, if an ordinary signing of an ordinary contract may be big news to people at that college, but it's not necessarily things that readers of a national publication broadly are going to be interested in. So in the spirit of looking at things that are new on the horizon, I'm often looking at new trends in the field and things that are emerging from those trends. I was thinking about this in the panel discussion of civility a few hours ago. Social media has completely changed how colleges think about and respond to attacks on academic freedom because, in many ways, what's said in a classroom is no longer confined to that classroom, and it's no longer an administration no longer has to have a faculty member's back just in terms of their fellow faculty members or their students or even the parents of their students. Sometimes the administrators end up with anybody who watches a cable news station, anybody on Facebook, potentially seeing a videotape of the faculty member in the classroom and what have you. So looking at how social media has changed the picture for faculty members is an emerging interesting issue for us. Looping back, the unionization of adjunct professors is a huge story for us. We're looking at related research on adjuncts' job conditions and the different supports that they have. Provisions of contracts remain interesting to us, and we're always trying to do. We've extensively covered the SEIU's metro organizing campaign, so we're always looking at that type of stuff. In terms of working with us or interacting with me and other people at the Chronicle, some practical things to think about. One is, realize that our mission is to cover the news and not necessarily to be anybody's publicist or whatever. So I often will hear people say, "We want attention for this," and I guess is from a journalist perspective, I have to find a news reason why there's a story there. The fact that somebody wants something publicized is not necessarily a reason for us to be covering it. We might cover it once it happens, but I was thinking about recently, some of the adjunct actions we held back on until we saw how many people actually showed up and what they were doing and things like that before covering them. We have to try to stay neutral on these things and almost inevitably the comment field after one of my stories is one person saying I'm in bed with management, the other person saying I'm in bed with labor. Usually they show up in the same comment field and I realize I've done the story just right, but but we have to kind of stay neutral and, as I said, have a news perspective there. In terms of people reaching out to us, probably the biggest thing where there's a lapse is people not recognizing how tight the deadline cycles are. I will get press releases on a contract or a development 2 or 3 days after it's written. I'll get press releases or emails saying contact person A or B, and those people are off on a beach somewhere or just completely inaccessible. So realizing our deadlines and how that works is important. There's really practical things people can do. You can write 2 versions of, if you know something's going to have a binary outcome, either the contract is approved or the contract is defeated, you can do kind of a Mad Lib thing of statements, this is great, this is terrible, this is a big win, this is a big loss, and just kind of have the 2 versions of what you're going to say ready to go as soon as the development happens and send out, hopefully, the right version. But But, you can prepare for news and things like that to be able to move quickly. And, other than that, I'm easily reachable at the Chronicle, peter.schmidt@chronicle.com. I'm certainly wanting to hear about the field broadly and to pay attention to it broadly, because you never know when there'll be a critical mass of small developments that suddenly make a trend in a given area. So, thank you.
Can I just add one?
Oh, absolutely.
I just want to second some of the very wise things Peter said. We have to worry about not just what you want us to write, but what our editors want us to write. And editors, as Peter said, are really concerned about where the news is going, what's the next important development. And I urge all of you, so many times, and as Peter said, we get news releases, phone calls from professors, from from PR people at law firms, at companies, at unions, saying, this is a good story, this is a good story. And I tell them, and I repeat to you, is put yourselves in our shoes, put yourselves in the shoes of our editors. They're going to ask, is this important to our readers? Not just, is it important to the unit chair of a faculty union at such and such a university? Is it going to be important to the readers of this newspaper? And if there's a dispute, say at Washington University in St. Louis, maybe you shouldn't approach the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, perhaps not even the Chronicle about it. Maybe you should just, contact the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You really have to figure out, what's the right audience, who is the right journalist to approach. It's very good to develop, relationships with the education reporter, whatever reporter, at your local paper. And last thing, I find it infinitely better when people send me emails than when they phone me at 4 p.m. when I'm on deadline. And phone calls, 20 years ago, we were much more willing to accept phone calls. Now we're inundated with emails. We have to write, for the daily paper, and it used to be you had to write for a story for like the 6 p.m. deadline. Now when something breaks at 10 a.m., you have to get it up on the web by 11 a.m., update it by 2 a.m., and then write a final story by 6 p.m. So there's like less time for phone calls. So emails are much more helpful. Also because it doesn't interrupt our train of thought and our deadline so much. And second, if it's a good idea, we could just shoot it over to our editors and say, I think this is a good idea, look at it. Whereas on a phone call, we got to type it up and then send the note over. I'll shut up.
Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions. Our journalists kind of gave us an idea of what the major trends are related to adjunct faculty and graduate student organizing and some practical advice, but we'll open this up to questions now. There are 2 microphones, one to my right and one to my left. You can line up and feel free to ask questions.
Actually, just maybe while somebody is thinking of a question, just the discussion about email. A lot of times things that, I agree wholeheartedly that email is the best way, especially when you're on a deadline. But sometimes faculty are subject to FOIA at some point. So I definitely encourage people writing about anything sensitive to write from a personal email account, possibly on a personal device, because I would never want to be sort of, responsible partially for something happening on the other end of you being a source. And I guess just one other point. There was some conversation about talking to, your local newspaper versus a national news outlet. And then I would also sort of make the same distinction between a mainstream news site, like the New York Times or something like that's in the trade media, like Inside Higher Ed. Because, well, these harrowing stories of adjuncts living out of their trunks are, need to be read and are actually incredible to report because they're just these most human, the definition essentially of a human interest story with so many other sort of amazing angles hanging off of it. Unfortunately, there are so many adjuncts living out of their cars that the trade media, we can't really write about them all, and it's a very sad fact.
You could do a series on the best looking adjuncts who live out of their cars.
Right. I guess so. We're sort of beyond the adjunct living out of their car feature, and so that just reminded me of something else, just because so much of the conversation has been focused on adjuncts here and today. I guess for a long time, the freeway flyer, the adjunct living out of their car sort of campaign was the major adjunct public image and PR sort of strategy. And while, again, harrowing and makes for a great, sad, important reading, for some reason I don't think it caught on like what I'm hearing more and more from activists lately, adjunct activists, our teaching conditions, our working conditions, our student learning conditions. For some reason that has really, probably obvious reasons, connected to tuition and student debt and all those things, that has really taken off. And so things more related to that angle, how adjunct employment conditions are actually impacting student learning conditions, are things that are really of interest to us, this sort of ability to show that it's not only a horrible way to treat your employees, but it's a horrible way to be running your organization that is about education.
Okay, questions? We have plenty of time here, so I'll wait for you to line up.
Hi, Gilda Bloom-Leyva, San Francisco State University. You write a lot about adjuncts. Adjuncts, there are many highly qualified adjuncts that should be on tenure track. What you don't seem to write about is the dilemma that is in the institution today. The AAUP indicates that 75% of colleges and universities across the country are employed by adjuncts. Subsequently, those of us on tenure track, have responsibilities such as RTP committees, hiring committees, in which the adjuncts are not allowed to participate in. So in my department, we've lost 25 faculty members to retirements and deaths. We now have 7 or 8 of us that are tenured. The rest are adjuncts. So we're doing the load of what used to be 25 faculty members and 13 adjuncts. Why don't you write about what is happening to institutions across the country when we create a caste system where we mistreat adjuncts? We give them, in the CSU, the California State University system, they have larger loads when they're full-time than the tenure track faculty. All of this is disruptive. I don't see articles about the damage to the institution in of itself. Thank you.
I think that's a really great point. And I think maybe I take for granted that a lot of that is sort of implicit in writing about adjuncts. And I definitely take that to heart, and we'll find more ways to bring that to light. But maybe something you can look at is the Delphi project on the changing faculty and student success at the University of Southern California, which has really been a crusader sort of research organization or vehicle in the adjuncts. Well, basically, the point is sort of what you're talking about. They study the faculty, the changing faculty. They don't really like these distinctions, right? Because it affects everybody. But they just put out a report that I wrote about, I think it was in March, and they made exactly the point that you did, basically saying that we are reaching a point, we don't know when, but it's there on the horizon for sure, that our institutions are no longer going to be able to function because all of these other things that faculty members are supposed to do besides teach are now falling onto the backs of our tenure track faculty. And, it's no, I think, fun in a lot of ways being a tenure track faculty member these days either. There are a lot of challenges in that field as well, or on that track as well. I guess I would just suggest you look at that report. And again, I would love to hear any and all of your story ideas about how, those of you who are tenure line, how adjunct employment is affecting you.
I'll throw out, we have covered how the burden of a lot of work has shifted on to full-time faculty members as a result of increased reliance on adjuncts. I mean, that's been woven into stories and things like that. And specifically in the area of shared governance and the degree to which part-time and full-time contingent faculty members get a voice in shared governance and how much of the burden for shared governance falls on tenure track people when they don't have a voice. We've looked at that issue. To speak candidly about it and maybe give a note of explanation, we have very organized efforts on behalf of the adjunct faculty members who are pushing for a living wage, advance notice when their class is canceled, things like that. There really isn't an organized voice from tenure track faculty members who are suddenly finding themselves having to spend 3 more hours in meetings a week, or whatever the outcome may be as a result of trends in the field. So to cover this issue, the challenge is to find research on how the tenure track faculty members' work burden has increased, or to hear from those faculty members themselves. But it's helpful to know how things get media attention and how they don't. I'm aware of the increased burden on tenure track faculty members as a result of trends in the field. I haven't really seen much research quantifying that and how much more it exists. The politics of part-time versus tenure track faculty members is such that at one point they're on the same page, other point they're taking shots at each other over one issue or another. So it doesn't really fit into necessarily a narrative of. It's a complicated picture. It's a slice of it, but it doesn't necessarily fit into a lot of other stories about how adjuncts are impacting tenure track faculty members and vice versa.
Honestly, I do not know whether the New York Times has written about this specific subject. I know the New York, every few years, a big academic saying the percentage of professors, courses being taught in the United States by adjuncts has risen to 72% or 70%, or up from several percentage less 5 or 10 years earlier. And that story will get good coverage, and maybe there'll be 2 paragraphs if the AAUP put out a good press release, saying, but this is putting an undue burden and weighs on full-time faculty. But this issue in itself, might be more for the education trade publications than for a general news publication. I'm not denigrating it. I'm not saying it's not important, but there are a whole lot of issues out there, and I can imagine editors and reporters saying there are sexier, more gripping, more important issues to write about.
On my right, yes.
Hi, Ernie Benjamin, AAUP. Peter made the comment about the need to be neutral, and everybody sort of accepted that. Being from AAUP and having given a lot of thought to that issue, I wonder how reporters think about it in contrast to how faculty do. We do have some notion about being objective, but neutral is tricky. For example, if the debate is whether human beings cause climate change or not, is it neutral to give equal coverage to the 2 sides, or is it neutral to recognize that 90% of the scientists who actually study it think that human beings do cause climate change? If we're talking about the bread and roses strike, as we were this morning, is it neutral to say, well, management of the textile factories and the workers who are out on strike for their basic livelihood, we just got to be neutral? Or do you try to think through the issue in some way and decide whether there is some position that makes sense in that particular case? At any rate, not being a reporter, and having thought about it mainly as a faculty member, I'm curious as to what you really mean when you say that you're going to be neutral.
It's a good question. And I've actually seen journalism discussed in different ways in recent years, or the discussion of journalism has evolved a bit in recent years, with people becoming very critical of journalists for not arriving at their side of an issue, or saying that fairness is a lazy thing to do, presenting both sides is a lazy thing to do. I do try to be analytical, and maybe in my earlier statement I should have said objective as opposed to neutral, although there's elements of both, because I have to be fair in a story. In a labor story, there will be, there's a management side and there's a labor side, and there might be 3 or 4 other sides to a labor dispute. I try to get all of them in and think my way through it. to move to the climate change subject, because that might be easier to talk about in these terms, although it's not a labor story. We try to, but I have written some coverage of academic freedom related to that. Something like that, we try to think about what the science says. We try to be informed about it. We try to look at statements skeptically and not take things on their face value. I don't think the Chronicle is going to be accused of being an organ of climate change denial. But that said, as soon as we as a publication adopt the view that climate change is a fact and we're going to be dismissive of anybody, there's no debate over this at all, and we're going to be dismissive of anybody who contradicts that, suddenly we lose credibility with a lot of people on another side of an issue, on the other side of the issue, or people who are still undecided about it. So, yes, we try to do analytical pieces. We talk about putting the Chronicle stamp on stories. We try to sort through conflicting claims and to provide some context and what have you. If something, doesn't seem to be borne out by the facts, we're making judgments about how much evidence people have all the time in reporting a story. Nonetheless, it is important to try to get all sides to give people a chance to defend themselves, things like that.
Just a very quick response. The New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Washington Post, they try to be, you could pick the word neutral, balanced. I don't like the word objective, because every time you pick a word, you're making a subjective choice. But we try to be balanced, we try to be fair. And I've written a whole lot of labor disputes over the years, and I try very hard to be balanced because the New York Times wants us to be balanced. If I'm writing the story for The Nation, I would be doing it very differently. But for the establishment press in the United States of America, unlike, say, in France with Le Monde or on the left, or Libération on the left, or Figaro on the right, we're supposed to pitch it straight down the middle. Now, when it comes to climate change, and Margaret Sullivan, the public editor of the New York Times, said, and many of us have debated that, if Ted Cruz says, the radical left ragged the New York Times, which he calls us, and he says, climate change is, he had this crazy, he said, people who believe in climate change are like the people who killed Galileo, or, some really weird ahistorical comment. And we could have, quote, a scientist or a Democratic senator responding saying, that's ridiculous, there's climate change. But I think the Times has concluded the way to handle something like that is quote Ted Cruz, maybe quote a Democrat responding to him, and then say, the latest study by the National Ocean Atmospheric, whatever, 98% of scientists believe that human activity has contributed to climate change, and that's 99%, and that's pretty definitive in responding to Ted Cruz. And Cruz might say, well, in quoting the scientists, who are just, part of this leftist conspiracy, we're not being neutral. But I think the truly balanced, neutral reader will understand what's going on.
So we have a question to my left.
Yeah, my name is Jeremy Thompson. I'm the Director of Higher Education for SCIU Local 509. I think I've spoken to Peter on the phone. It's nice to put a face to a voice. I have two questions. One is, first of all, besides the stuff you've spoken about, which seemed somewhat, retrospective and ongoing, what are some of the big stories in higher ed to come that maybe some of us in the room aren't aware of? And then also, what do you think about the $15,000 per course demand that has been put out there in the past couple of months?
As Peter's spokesman, he's not allowed to take a point of view on that.
I might dodge the question on emerging stories in the field because I don't necessarily want to give my stories away here, but certainly. Broadly covering the field, journalism often is the skill is predicting train wrecks, and if you're going to cover the train wreck, it helps to see the two trains going in the wrong direction and knowing, or what tensions are likely to emerge. So I'm certainly following tensions that are emerging as a result of different developments out there, changes in labor law, what that's going to mean. We had people from a Catholic College Association in the office the other day talking about religious college objections to tensions are likely to emerge in colleges, and how they might even change their behavior or their description of faculty members to be able to argue that they're religious. So that's an example. Clearly, with the unionization of adjuncts, trends within contracts that emerge are going to be a big story for us, as is, the question of whether this unionization actually brings about improvements in their conditions broadly, and, the question of where the money for that is going to come from, and if there is the administrative fat to cut, or tuition increases are going to happen, or how exactly we're going to move from a higher ed financing market where a very low-paid faction of segment of the workforce helps keep the bottom line intact. As far as the $15,000 pay and compensation request, it's an interesting thing to cover, and I come to this from the perspective of covering state politics and how people think about state politics, and I'm not sure how that's going to go. I mean, on the one hand, you do the math in your head, and it sounds like adjuncts are asking for basically a middle-class existence from their work, and I don't know if you can deny somebody, or a solid middle-class existence from their work, and I don't know if you can deny somebody who's gotten a doctorate that kind of income. At the other hand, I've seen things play out in state political debates in Wisconsin or what have you, where our economy has so restructured that so many people are not paid very well anymore. And I think, especially if it's in a public institution and you're asking people to be paid for out of tax dollars or something, I've seen politicians make hay out of, somebody basically by saying, hey, they want your tax dollar to make a lot more money than you do. And I've seen that throughout public sector unions. I mean, I'm from around Detroit originally. I've seen that debate emerge in terms of their discussions of how they're going to handle that city's finances and all that stuff. So, I'm trying not to pass judgment on the request itself, but I can foresee pushback on it politically, and it's an aspirational goal. It's certainly a long ways from what adjuncts are making right now. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.